Hi, everyone. I hope you guys are having a great week. I'm going to be talking a little bit about chapter 2 today from the textbook. So we're going to be talking a little bit about the history. Although I'll have you probably read more about the history of the different regions from the textbook. We're going to talk a little bit about family violence from a legal perspective, and then we're going to cover some terminology, again, that's used in the field. So, um, again, there's been a long history of patriarchy that's happened throughout the entire world. So I want you to make sure to go into the textbook and read about the different forms of patriarchy that has existed in the different regions of the world. But patriarchy is a social system that recognizes the complete dominance of men over women, typically strengthened by law or laws, in addition to custom and oftentimes religion. So, again, go and read some more information about the different regions and the history of patriarchy in that region. So, within the United States, by the 1870s, um, the judges no longer allowed a husband to claim a legal right to beat his wife. Although oftentimes abuse occurred behind closed doors. Both the stitch rule and the curtain rule were informally used by police to determine whether to make an arrest in a domestic violence case. So, again, the textbook talks a little bit more about that. There's some controversy regarding the phrase, the rule of thumb. And so some people say it was found, to be um, an informal rule, which is you cannot beat a woman with anything wider than the width of your thumb. And so I personally don't like the term the rule of thumb. I'll use, the rule of thought or something like that instead. But supposedly, and some people have challenged this, but supposedly there was an informal rule of thumb, which is a man cannot beat a woman with anything wider than the width of his thumb. And so it really, intimate partner violence and child abuse emerged as social issues within the United States, really within the 1960s. And so up until then, it was really something that happened behind closed doors and wasn't really talked about a lot. Special abuse was classified as a misdemeanor, and police were not allowed to intervene unless they personally witnessed the abuse. Police officers were trained to separate the parties for a cooling off period. And then new legislation was needed to help victims, but debates centered on what type of intervention would be the most appropriate. So, again, really, this did not get a lot of attention in the public eye until the 1960s. And so today, obviously, there's very different legal and criminal violations that happen. Each state has their own definition and their own legislation. So I want you to be aware of that within your state. To be considered family violence, the act must be forbidden by law and the perpetrator must be related to the victim in some way. And so that may include, again, a current or a former dating partner, married partner, or cohabitating partner, oftentimes. So that's how they kind of find that relationship. Victims are from every walk of life. We see all different socioeconomic backgrounds. We see every race, every religion, men, women, LGBTQ, young and old as well. So again, intimate partner violence, we talked a little bit about this in chapter 1, refers to violence committed within an adult relationship, regardless of gender, and is generally part of an ongoing pattern of behavior. There's lots of different forms of control and coercion that they might use, such as finances or economic. coercion. They may also use social isolation, so isolating them and slowly pulling them away from friends and family members. Usually, again, when we talked about that cycle of violence, it increases in frequency and in severity over time. So, a little background on child abuse and neglect. We'll go into a lot more detail in this specific chapter later on, but it refers to any act that is committed against a child by a caretaker that causes death, harm, or risk of harm. It also includes something like failure to provide care. So you might see something like medical neglect, or some which might include like dental neglect as well. Every state has a department that is devoted specifically to the protection of children. So obviously in Texas, Child Protective Services, CPS. And then there's two levels of protection. There's civil protection, which includes Child Protective Services, and then there's criminal, right? And so this is obviously for severe forms of physical or sexual abuse. They can be prosecuted criminally. Child maltreatment, child abuse occurs at higher rates than intimate partner violence. And then a little background on elder abuse. It may involve physical, sexual, emotional violence, neglect, abandonment, or financial exploitation. So again, it can also be criminal or civil. It may require social intervention and mandated reporting by officials. Again, it varies from state to state. In Texas, we have APS, so Adult Protective Services. One of the things from a criminal standpoint that we really have to look at is probable cause that a crime has been committed is the standard for law enforcement to arrest. Not the amount of physical harm to the victim. So probable cause that a crime has been committed. The arrest of a perpetrator is not the punishment. It is the legal intervention that happens. The punishment is actually decided by the courts. And so they might be arrested, that's the intervention, and then they have to go to court later on to determine what their punishment for the crime is. And the act must be something that is prohibited by law, right? And so again, that's why during the sexual abuse and the emotional abuse section, it has to be something that's done that's prohibited by law in order for law enforcement to really intervene in a way that removes the abuser. And so these are obviously different forms of abuse that are prohibited by law. Finally, some common terms. Again, this is some information that comes straight from the textbook. What neglect is failure to provide or refusal to provide care when there is an obligation to do so. Physical abuse, the use of force or threat of force that may result in bodily injury, and psychological abuse, which is the intentional infliction of anguish, pain, or distress. And then finally, sexual abuse is non-consensual sexual contact of any kind. So that's a little brief summary of chapter 2. As always, please let me know if you guys have any questions, and I hope you have a great week. Thank you so much.